Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, so as we start every morning, if there is any question from the previous session, then we'll take that first, and then we'll proceed to the agenda for today. Great. So yesterday we were talking about that if I have to do regression, one minute, just let me open the right one. Just give me 2 minutes. So yesterday we were talking about that if we are running a regression, and regression is about finding the relationship between the features or in the data frame what we had as different columns, which are the different, also called as attributes, the different attributes of a given object or a given purpose or a given entity. And then with those features we are trying to predict what the value of some other thing could be. And we had taken the example of, can we predict the level of rice production in the country based on the rainfall? Can we, similarly for in other areas, can we predict the total sales and profit for a company or for a shop based on the footfall that we have in the mall? So these are the things that we, as data scientists, one of the key things that we would be doing, that we are given data about a few aspects of a business, and then we will have to see, we will have to make predictions about something else. And one of the examples that we are working with now is the housing price, where we have been given data about the some proxy for the size of the house. For example, how many rooms are there, how many bedrooms are there, some proxy for the location in form of latitude, longitude, whether they are near the ocean, near the bay, and some information about what is the income of the people who live in those houses. Based on these, we would be trying to predict what the price of a house should be, and that we are doing based on certain past data which has been given to us, where these characteristics of the house is given to us and the prices of the house is given to us. Based on that, we should be able to make predictions for our customers, either the buyers or the seller, for future. Then we took a simple example of that if I am trying to predict the price of the house as it is normally quoted in the media, or when you want to buy a house, it will be normally quoted in terms of um, what is the area and what is the price per square feet. So we were working with an Excel sheet where we said that if I have been given the prices of certain houses and I have been given the area of those houses, based on that, can I make an estimate what the price of another house could be? And then we found that we we do certain trial and error where we say that, okay, if I assume that the price is 7,000 per square feet, then what is the price of house 1, house 2, house 3? And then we find that there are certain errors. It means that at if I assume that the price is 7,000, then I have some prediction for the value of each house. I also know what the actual price of those houses were, and therefore I am able to find the error. And then I quantify the accuracy of my prediction in terms of what we call as the variance or the RMSE, where we compute what is the error in the prediction, and then we take the square of the error, we sum the error, we take the average of the error, and then we take the square root of the summed error. That's called the RMSE, or the root mean square of the errors. That becomes one of the key thing for us to minimize. And then we also talked about the other measure, which is the R square. So two very important things for regression. One is the RMSE, which is the root mean square of error. The second one is the R square. So R square tells us that out of the total variation that, or total variance that the um, actual house prices has, how much of that variation we have been able to capture, or how much of the variation we have been able to explain with our regression formula. So regression formula looks like y is equal to b plus bx plus c, where y is the value of the prediction variable, the variable that we are trying to predict, or it's also called the independent variable, and the x is the dependent variable. In this case, the price of the house is the independent variable and the area of the house is the dependent variable. So we put that in the form of a bx plus c, and c is some constant. So finding out this equation, or finding out this relationship, is actually the most important thing in the regression. But once we establish a relationship, then the question was that whether this is good or bad. Can I really improve the performance of my prediction? It means that can I become nearer to the, and when we say that increasing the performance of the prediction, actually we are talking about, can we make our prediction closer to the actual value? Is my prediction, we will never be able to get the exact value, but can we come closer to it? And then the question was that how do we refine our prediction? And then we saw that if we reduce the RMSE, or if we increase the R square, then my prediction is becoming more and more accurate. So we did that with the trial and error, but then we need to understand that how it can be done with the use of statistics or use of mathematics. So what we did was that first we saw that if at different prices, what is the variance or what is the RMSE, and it was coming into some sort of a U curve here, where if the price is too low or if the price is too high compared to the real price in the market, then my variance is high, and then it can be plotted like this. Once we plot like this, now we can use certain concepts of calculus, and mathematically we can find out what is the price, what is the most accurate price, or what is the price at which my prediction is closest to the actual. And that will mean what is the price at which my RMSE is the lowest, or my variance is the lowest, or my R square is the highest. So we are right now working with one of these criteria, which is the variance. And of course, if we are reducing the variance, we will reduce the uh, RMSE as well. Okay. So now we are trying to mathematically establish that how do we find the best price. Then we said that we take any random number. We can take our first estimator as say 3000 and then see what is the variance. And then we see what is the gradient or what is the slope of the variance at that point in time. Then we also maybe take another random variable. Suppose the first variable that we took was 9000. Again, we see that we get some value of the variance, and then we see what is the slope of that. So whatever be the slope, it would be positive or negative. The idea is that we need to come to the place where my slope is 0. So at this point of time, at the bottom, at the minima, the slope would be 0. Okay. So if we can gradually find out a place where the slope is 0, then we have found out that this is the best estimation that we can do with regression. Okay. But how do we find the slope? The process of finding the minima using the slope or the gradient. Slope is also called as gradient. How do we compute the slope? We had discussed earlier that the slope of any line, we had discussed that how do we find the slope. So the basic idea behind finding a slope, that if it is a straight line, we just find out what is the change in the x-axis or the x value, and depending upon, and because of that change in x value, what is the change in the y value. So change in y is shown as delta y or dy, and change in x is shown as dx. So it is called dy by dx. So dy by dx gives me the slope of the straight line or a curve between 2 points. Okay. Now, having understood how do we compute the slope, then we came across the problem that in a straight line, the slope will remain constant, whereas for a curve, the slope will go on changing, and that's where one of the key problems in statistics is to find out that what is the slope at a given point in time. And then we came across the concept of the dy by dx in calculus, where d represents delta or a very small change. So we say that the slope of the curve at a given point of time is denoted by dy by dx, where dy by dx represent a very small change in the value of y and a very small, because of a very small change in the value of x. So that's how we find the slope. Okay. Now coming back to this problem, then we are saying that, okay, if I make my first estimate at 3000, then I compute the slope, and then we see that I need to move to the right. It means that I need to increase my estimation. Earlier I had used 3000, now I need to increase it by some value. So let's assume that we increase that by 1000. So we increase it to 4000. That's what this process depicts. And that's what the name of the process is. It's called gradient descent. It means that first we find out the gradient, then we descend towards 0. Whether our gradient is minus 20 or plus 20, and from there we gradually descend towards the value of 0. That is what this graph actually shows you. So that's the process which our algorithms follow. Now, it's called the gradient descent because we first compute the gradient and then we descend towards 0. Now, if you see, so in the data set that we have, our algorithm actually works in the same fashion as, suppose if we blindfold you and we put you onto a mountain or a hillock and say that now you have to reach to the bottom. So you are placed somewhere on the mountain, and then we say that, and we blindfold you, and we say that now you have to reach to the bottom. Now, how do you find out that how would you reach the bottom as a person who is completely blindfolded? What would any person do? He will take a step in any direction, and suppose he finds that the step is going up, or he sees that if he takes the step to the left, he is going up because I can feel that whether the step is up or down. And then if he feels that the on the left side the mountain is actually going up, then you will take a step to the right actually, and then see that okay, if the right one is going down, then I'll start moving in the right direction. So step by step, I'll take one step and see that I am going down. Then again, I'll take another step until I come to a place where I take a step either to the left or to the right. On both sides, I will start going up. So if on both sides, if I start going up as a blindfolded man in the mountain, then I know that I have reached the bottom of the valley, because on both sides, now I can only go up, and therefore I must be at the bottom. So that's the same logic of the blindfolded man trying to reach at the bottom of the mountain. The same thing happens with our algorithms. So our algorithms, in the process of optimization, it behaves like as if it is a blindfolded man, not in the mountain, but in the mountain of data. So in the mountain of data, if I have to find out what is the best estimate or what is the minimum RMSE that we get, the algorithms work in the same fashion as we would work if we are blindfolded in a mountain. So similarly, the gradient descent actually works like a blindfolded man in the mountain of data. So it will find out the gradient at a given place, then it will move towards zero. That's why this process is called the gradient descent. So with the help of the gradient, you descend to the best estimation, or you descend to the lowest value of your RMSE. Okay. Now this one, as we discussed very briefly, is one of the most important concepts in the machine learning and deep learning, and that's why it is important for us to understand what this gradient descent is all about. And this gradient descent is very easily understood in terms of a blindfolded man left in the mountain. The same process our gradient descent algorithm also does. Okay. So then we were applying what are the things in the gradient descent. Oops. Okay. What are the steps involved here? So first I make a random estimation, then I find out the gradient. Then depending upon whether I have positive gradient or a lower gradient, then we make a change towards or make a step towards zero. Now, when we're defining the algorithm, one of the things that we'll have to tell the machine that how large the step could be. As a as a human being, if we are trying to find out the valley in a mountain, there is a limitation on how long a step we can take. If we take too large a step, and especially if we are blindfolded, we may actually fall. And if we take very small steps, it will take us a long time to reach the valley. Same thing happens here also. So here we have the option to define the step, the size of the step, and that is called the learning rate. It means that so these are called the learning step. So how long would be my learning step? It means that in how big steps we are actually moving towards the minima. So that is called the learning rate, and the symbol that we use is symbol that we use for that is here. If you see, it's called eta. So learning rate is given a symbol of eta, and then we can define what the eta would be. And then after having found the eta, then we define the new weight. And the new weight, normally we say that take the weight or the value or the, when we say weight, it is actually the b in our equation of the uh, regression. The b is actually the weight. So y is equal to bx plus c. We are now trying to find out the value of b. So we first took the, say, value of b was 3000. Then we find out the gradient at that place. Then we multiply the gradient with the learning rate and we deduct that from the weight, and that is the new weight. So suppose my gradient at that point of time was, say, 20, and we take a learning rate of 0.2. So 20 into 0.2, that becomes 4, and my 20 into 0.2 will be 4. Yeah, okay. And then my previous weight was, say, 3000. So 3000 minus 4. So actually, if we are at this place, our gradient would be negative. So if we are on the left side of the minima, our gradient would be negative. If we are on the right side, my gradient would be positive. So at 3000, suppose my gradient is minus 20 and my learning rate is 0.4, 0.2, then the value of the learning rate into gradient, that becomes minus 4. No, yeah. So weight is 3000, 3000 minus 4, that will become 3004. So my next weight, so next value at which the system would compute what is the RMSE, that would be using the value of 3004. And that's how the steps would be taken. That's how. So it will compute with 3004. Then maybe the next one is 3008. So it will compute the value with 3008 and so on and so forth. Okay. That's how we will find out the minimum. But there is a problem here. The problem is like this. So what we saw was a very nice U curve, and therefore we will come to the bottom easily. But the real life data may not be having that kind of property where I get a very good U curve. The actual data that we are experimenting with, or the actual shape of the mountain, may be something like this. So the question would be that how do I find what is the minima? Because the logic that we are using is that we are descending the hill and then we are stopping at a point where the gradient becomes zero, or at a point where whether I move to the left or whether I move to the right, I see that I start going uphill. So suppose, and since we are choosing our starting point randomly, it is possible that somebody started here. Somebody took this as the starting point. Then he will gradually descend this curve and he will reach this point. And then on both sides, the gradient of that particular place has become zero. It means that from there, either you step to the left or you step to the right. I start going up. So I will feel that I have reached the bottom of the valley. That's what even the gradient, even the algorithm would do. It will see that, okay, I have reached the bottom and therefore this is the minimum. But in reality, you find that this is not the minimum. The minimum is actually this. So this is one of the problems that we will have to solve even with the gradient descent. That if the data has multiple minima, then which one is the actual minimum, or which is the minimum of all the minima that we get? This is a real problem that we will have to solve when we are trying to find out the best estimation using the gradient descent. Now, what could be the solution to this? Suppose somebody starts from here, because we are choosing the starting point randomly. We don't know where to start, so we'll starting point randomly. And somebody starts here. So one person will be able to reach the actual bottom, and one person will reach and feel that this is the actual bottom, which is not the actual bottom. So how do we resolve this? One of the simple ways to resolve it is that rather than just doing one iteration, I will do multiple iterations, and then we will see that which one is the minimum of that. So I'll do the first iteration where I start from here. Okay. Then I will find this minima. Then I'll do the second random selection. Second random selection also, possibly I take this point. Then again I'll reach this same point. Then I'll make the third iteration, and possibly in the third iteration I take this point. Then I'll gradually descend along this line and come to this point and find that okay, now the gradient has become zero. In the fourth iteration, possibly I'll start somewhere here, and then I'll start going down like this. In the fifth iteration, maybe I choose this point, and then I find here. So the good part is that since the computing power is so efficient nowadays, that I can afford to do thousands of such iterations. And then I'll go on recording what is the minimum. And then out of all those thousand iterations, multiple minimum that I have got, whatever is the actual or the minimum of the minima, that I will say that is the right or is the best estimator that we have. So now some of you may be wondering now that if we are doing this trial and error itself, is that really a very scientific way of doing it? So we are talking about all the use of statistics, mathematics, but eventually, but that's what machine learning actually does to a large extent. By the use of computing power and by use of some very simple mathematics and calculus, we are trying to find out the best estimation. And that is one of the reasons that we talked about earlier, that until that kind of computing power was available, and until somebody found out this mathematical way to find out the minima or maxima from the large amount of data, maybe all of you could go on to mute, so the background noise will go away. So that's what the today's scenario is, that we cannot find out the best estimator by a given formula. That formula that you saw even in the Excel sheet is found out by multiple iterations in the backend. And the computing power to us today, it gives us the facility, or it enables us to go through those multiple iterations. Okay. But in real life, we have talked either in the previous case where there was a very nice U curve and it was very easy to descend to the bottom, or we have a curve like this where there could be multiple bottoms. We are still talking about only two-dimensional data. On one dimension, I have the value of the x, and the other dimension, I have the value of the y. But in real life, the x will not be a single dimension. Just like our housing data, there could be maybe 10 different dimensions that we have, or 10 different features that we have. Each feature actually represents one dimension. So if I have a multi-dimensional data, our curve will not look like this. Our curve may look like this. So this is in the 3 dimension. So as you have different shapes and sizes of the mountain, similarly, you will have different types of data. And in that one, finding out the bottom is just like, your one could be trying to reach the bottom in this kind of hill. The second one could be trying to find out the bottom in this kind of hill. The third one may actually land up getting a data which has this kind of shape of the data. Now it is because of the various shape that you have for the mountains in reality and different shapes of the data that you have, no single formula or no single equation can actually determine how to find the bottoms in this hill or this hill or this hill. And that is where we have to resort to the trial and error, because each mountain has its own shape and no one formula will actually work for all three mountains here. Similarly, when we get the data, the shape of the data or the contours of the data will not be the same, and therefore we cannot really find out a formula that this is the formula that you use to use if you want to find the minima in these three different types of data set that we have. And that is one of the other reasons that we have to use the trial and error of this using the stochastic gradient method. So take, for example, this particular data set, which has multiple minima and multiple maxima. This one also depicts that how do we really reach the top or the bottom. So this one is a three-dimensional depiction of the very nice U curve that we have. Here, finding out the bottom is not going to be a problem. Now, but if your data set is like this, and if you start at some point, you have the possibility that you may end at one of these multiple bottoms that this has. So there is a possibility that I may reach here. There is a possibility that I will reach here. There is a possibility that I will reach here. But as we discussed earlier, that also does not really matter much now, because I can start with thousands of random points. So if I start with some random point here, I may get to this bottom. If I start with the random point here, I may get to this bottom. And therefore, I take all the value of all the bottoms or all the minima that I have achieved, and then I can take the minimum of all the minima that I have got. And then still I can find out what the real bottom is. But it is still possible that I have not reached the real bottom, because maybe out of the 1,000 iterations I do, I may still not be able to find a point where I got the actual minima. But the chances or the probability that I will have the actual minima if I start with 1,000 different random points is very high. So that is one of the key things which in the data science or in the machine learning prediction is that it does not give you the full confidence that yes, this is the best solution possible. There could be some other best solution. There could be some other solution which could be better than this. But the idea here is that can we find out a solution which is close enough, and therefore we can live with this. And that's one of the key differences between the software 1.0 and software 2.0. When we say software 1.0, it is the current system of developing software where we say that I have the logic, and those logic, I code that logic into my using different languages. So the logic could be given, and then I code that in either Java or .NET or Python. But the logic is known to the human beings. The logic is there in the human brain. So what's the process today? You go to the BAs in your team will speak to the business. They understand the logic, the context. Then they explain to the developers. Those developers encode that logic into one of the chosen languages. That is what the process is. And how does the testing go about? We prepare the test cases where we say that, okay, if this is the scenario, this is my expected answer. And then if the system is not giving me the expected answer, then we say that there is a bug in the system. That is what the process is. Now, when we come to the designing the development and testing life cycle for a data science process, then now we are talking about the system. So I give data to the system. The system says that this is the logic, but that logic is not giving me, or that logic is not assuring me the optimum result or the best result all the time. It says in the terms of probability. So the answer that we will get from my optimization process, it will tell me that most probably this is the right answer. It will not tell you with complete confidence that yes, this is the answer, because we are walking in the mountain like a blind man trying to find out the valley. So that's the difference. So even when you draw your test strategy, then unlike in the software 1.0, if we have to draw a test strategy for my data science projects, then we have to live with these probabilities. So rather than trying to assess the actual outcome as we do today, that in my test cases say that this is the input, this is the expected output. And then we match those two, and then we say that there is a bug or not. When we are drawing the test strategy for our data science projects, now that strategy we cannot use, because I will not have a deterministic answer. I will not be having an answer which will say that this is the answer and you go and match with the answer that system do. Because as we will see when we do the different data science projects, that the suppose if you're making a prediction, even if you run the same program again, you will get two different answers. So we cannot have the same test strategy. So therefore, my strategy moves away from comparing the expected result with the actual result. My strategy moves to trying to see that how much confident we are about the result, and there are ways to measure those confidence. So that's how the optimization problems will actually work. Now, now we have understood how to take certain measures of statistics to say that we are having a good estimation or not. If the estimation, if the slope of my variance or RMSE is zero or very close to zero, then I know that I have reached the bottom, and therefore that's a good estimator. How to reach there, we have seen. We will use the calculus, and calculus is used to find out the gradient or the slope. So we'll spend some time on just revisiting very quickly. All of you may have done the calculus earlier. So the most important thing in calculus would be how to find out the gradient, and we said that we find the gradient by differentiation, and differentiation is done in this fashion. That is, if you say y is equal to x square, the dy by dx would be 2x. If it is x cubed, it will be 3x. Okay, and if we generalize the formula, dy by dx is, and if y is equal to x to the power n, then the differentiation or the slope or the gradient would be n, that is whatever is the power to which x has been raised, that becomes the multiplier, and then it will be x, and then n will become n minus 1. Okay, so this is the thing that also you need to recall and remember, because most of you would have done calculus in your +2, and this is important to know. So how we do the differentiation, that is what we need to know, and there are a few other things like chain rule and all that we'll study sometime later. But at this point of time, since it is important in the context of the gradient descent, we need to understand how do we do the differentiation using calculus. The formula is actually, or the process is very simple. We are talking about a process uh, where my formula would be in the form of A is equal to, y is equal to A or B, whatever formula and whatever letter you want to use, but normally we'll use B for beta, uh, multiplied by x, and that x could be could be only x, or it could be x squared, x cubed, or any other degree of the value plus c. And when we take the differentiation of that, it becomes dy by dx, which is the differentiation of this particular equation. And that value will become, a will remain as it is. Now x to the power n will become n multiplied by x raised to the power n minus 1. So what does this denote? This actually denotes what is the meaning of this part. So when we say that this is the differentiation, or this is, by differentiating we are finding the slope of the curve, what we are saying is that if the shape of the curve is given by this formula, because this formula actually defines the shape of the curve, if this is the shape of the curve, then the differentiation or the slope would be computed by, if there is a multiplier b here, that will be b, and then whatever is the power to which x has been raised, that n, and then x raised to the power n minus 1. So we will see in our previous example that how do we compute the dy by dx at any given point in time. So this is a simple part of the calculus which also you need to remember, that how do we find out the differentiation um, or the slope or the gradient at any given point in time. Okay, so having understood the gradient descent, let's go back to our Excel sheet and what we were doing here. This is what we had done, that we had computed the variance, have computed the RMSE also. So we can just change this plot to RMSE, because normally we will use the RMSE for our optimization. We can use the variance or the RMSE. The system is able to take any of these optimization parameters and do the optimization. So if I draw these numbers, not for the sum of the square, but for the RMSE, I'll just change its series value. So now I have only the gradient descent. We can do either on the value of the variance or on the value of RMSE, but the process will remain more or less the same. Okay. So what are we? So here I am just trying to show you that at any given point of time, we can compute the slope, and there are the slope computation. We have seen that if it is a straight line, we'll find a change in the value of x, and with that, how much is the change in the value of y. Similarly, if it is a curve, which in most cases we'll be finding out a curve, we have seen the how to find the slope by using calculus. So gradually we will come, and in this case, we will see that what is the point at which my RMSE is actually increasing on both sides. So we see that when we come to around, say, 5,750 or 5,846, then either way that we move, my RMSE is actually increasing. So this is the minimum RMSE that we are having, and therefore 5,846 is the best estimation that we can have with this data. Okay. Now let's start thinking from the mind of the data set, that now for understanding the concept, we have taken data of only 4 houses. But in our housing data set, we had 20,000. And in several of the other data sets, you will get millions of records. Now we need to start thinking that how much computation is involved, and can we really find out a process where the computational burden on our algorithms, on our machine can be reduced. So if you're doing the computation only with, say, these 4 numbers, it's actually very easy. We can go on doing maybe thousands and thousands of iterations, and the system will do that in a jiffy, in a very fast manner. But if I have here a million record, how much computation would be involved? So if you see, how are we finding out the RMSE? I am taking my estimation of, say, 9,000. So my first estimate is that price of the house is 9,000 rupees per square feet. That is my first random estimate. Using that, I compute the prediction. So I make the prediction. So here we have taken the value of, say, 5,000 rupees. Based on that, I first compute the prediction. So just now start thinking about the large data sets that we will have, that I have, say, 1 million record. So first I make an estimation of 1 million records. Then I'll find out the deviation for the entire 1 million records. So for each record, I will find that what was the actual price, what is my estimation, then what is the deviation. Then for 1 million records, I'll take the square of that, then I'll sum, then I'll divide that by 1 million, and then I'll take a square root. So you see how many computations are involved, and these computations will actually grow by the multiple times the size of data that you have. So if you have data for, say, 10,000, then the number of computations involved will be 10,000. I'll make the prediction for 10,000 records. I'll find the deviation for 10,000, so 20,000. I'll take the square. That will be another operation. So 20,000, and then again 30,000, and then maybe a few other operations. So roughly about 30,000 operations I'll have to do to find out what is my deviation. Now, having got that deviation, then I'll find out the slope. Then I'll see that what to do next. But if my data set is, say, not 10,000, but say 100,000 or 1 lakh, then I'll have to do the computation of about 3 lakh computations for one step. It means that in finding out the RMSE and then deciding that whether to go left or right, so roughly about 3 lakh computations are there. So if you see, it is growing proportionately to the size of the data you have. So if you have, say, 1 million records, you will end up doing maybe roughly about 3 million computations just to take your first step. And that's where people started wondering that, is there an efficient way? And that's where you will see that the pure statisticians, they don't really like the data scientists, because the pure statistician will actually would like to follow a process which is not looking like a trial and error, and which is not taking the shortcuts which we take in data science. Because we need to be also concerned about the computation time, how much resources I have available, what is the computing resource available, what is the time available. And therefore, in data scientists take a lot of shortcuts. And these shortcuts, the people who are very particular about the purity of the process, they feel uncomfortable with that, and they will say that, you are doing this trial and error, this is not pure math, this is not pure statistics. But that's the compromise we have to do between trying to be very pure from the perspective of statistics or mathematics, and trying to find out a result which actually works. The entire business world is not really looking at the perfect result. We are looking at something with which we can work with. As human beings, also, all of us are not perfect, but in the organization, we come together and work. So that's what the business needs. And that's where the business folks or the senior management in the businesses, they like data scientists much more than the mathematicians or the uh, people who are experts in the statistics, because they data scientists give them a very practical solution within a given time frame by minimizing the resources that we may need to compute. So as they say that it is better to be approximately right than precisely wrong. So if it is approximately right, it is good for business. We don't need to make exact prediction even for the weather. If you're able to make an estimation that okay, tomorrow it is going to rain, whether it rains in the morning or evening, it's okay, it's acceptable. But nowadays, of course, we are able to make much more accurate prediction, and we can give the timing also that tomorrow morning it will rain or tomorrow evening it will be cloudy. But still, it is not that we are making a prediction exactly in terms of the minute and the second. You say that tomorrow morning it will rain, or maybe tomorrow morning between 7 and 8 it will rain. That is acceptable to us. So in terms of computing this gradient descent, if we have to do so many of computations, say if I have 1 million records and we do the computation of the, or we do the prediction for each 1 million, that is very time consuming, that's very resource consuming. And that's where the data scientists came with an algorithm which is called the stochastic gradient descent. Now, stochastic is a term used for randomness. Okay. So in this stochastic gradient descent, what we do is that we don't compute the variance for the entire data set as we have done here. So here you see all these variances or the deviation we have taken. Then we have computed the square for all of these, and then we took a sum, and that is what we have drawn here. What data scientists came and said that do we really need to do this kind of computation for all the records all the time? Let's not do that. Let's take only one example. So I have 1 million example, but I'll find out the deviation only for one record. So rather than taking all the four here, what the shortcut says is you just do the computation for only one, and you find out the deviation or the gradient or the slope using just one data point. So here we see that there is a deviation and there is a, so our deviation is 2500, and then we'll find the slope by using just this data and then perform the same operation here. Now the question would be that would it give me the same kind of result? It would not give you the same kind of result. But this iteration, rather than doing 1 million computation, now I can do this iteration for multiple records, maybe 10,000 iterations or 1 million iterations. And not by the force of logic, but by force of experiment, we see that even if we take just one data point and start descending, it will be more erratic. So for example, if I take the average here, I will move smoothly towards this curve. But if I take this one data point, then I could land anywhere, and my process would be a bit more erratic. I will require more iterations. Now, that is what the tussle between the pure mathematicians, the pure statisticians, and the data scientists would be, that data scientists came out with this shortcut and said that let's compute our gradient on a single record by choosing it randomly. So that is the stochastic gradient, and in that process I reduce my computation in a million data set. So in the data set, if I have million records, I actually reduce the computation by 3 million, whatever was the earlier process, divide that by 3 million, because I am reducing that 3 million computation for every iteration to just 3 computations. So I am making the process more efficient by 3 million times. In this case, our process will become more efficient just by maybe 4 times, because we are having only 4 records here. So that process is called the stochastic gradient. Just I am seeing one of the questions here. Okay. So I saw this question a bit late. Yeah. So Hemant is asking the question that we are taking the example of only one feature, but in real life we'll have multiple features. I think I tried to answer that question earlier. That in the real life, yes, we will have many factors, and therefore my equation will not be just y is equal to bx plus c. The form of the equation would be y is equal to b1 x1 plus b2 x2 plus b2 x3 plus b3 x3. That is what the normal form of the equation will be, where x1, x2, x3 are the different features or different factors which we are taking into consideration in making the prediction. Not only that, the relationship need not always be linear. Until now, what we have talked about is the linear regression, but the relationship could be polynomial. When we say polynomial, my equation could take a form of, as we have seen in the in our own equation here, that if you see it is x square. If you see our equation here, there is x and there is here x square here. This term is x square. So our relationship need not be as simple as bx or b1 x1 plus b2 x2 plus bn x1. So if I have n number of features, our equation would be b1 x1, b2 x2, b3 x3, and going up to b1 x1. Not only that, our relationship need not be linear. It could be b1 x1 plus b2 x square plus something. So it can go to square, it can be go to cube, then degree of 4, degree of 4, 5. All these different types of relationships will create the different types of shapes of the hills, as we have seen earlier. So Hemant, is this question clear to you? I mean, the answer clear to you? Yeah, great. And that's the reason that, we can't really have a formula to give you the answer. We have to go on experimenting with trial and error. So coming back to the we were trying to find out some shortcuts or efficient ways. So rather than computing this value of 10,000, where we must first make the estimation for all the 4 records that we have, or all the million records that we have, now we take a shortcut and say that I'll just assume that I have only one data point, which is this house. Then I will take an estimator. I'll compute that whether I am making the right kind of prediction or not. So in this case, suppose I am starting with, let's say, 5,000. That's the number I have taken here. I have I take data only for the first house, which is 5,000, and I feel that
it shows me a deviation of say 50 lakhs in the price. So the actual price was 3 crores. My estimation was 2.5 crores. And then, having known this, now I find that I need to increase the price because my gradient at this point of time would be negative. So I'll increase it from 5,000 to 5,200, and then I'll try to get the get at the minima. Having done that, I'll again start with another random point. So rather than taking the RMSE across the data set, I take only for one data set or only one data element. That process is called the stochastic gradient descent. Now there is a compromise in between where we will say that, okay, see, the machines that we use, it has the parallel processing mechanism. That is, I can run multiple threads at the same time, and therefore, if I just use one data point, I can run only one thread of the computer that I have available. So it's not really saving me time. I can run multiple threads. So I can actually do the simultaneous computation across different in the parallel processing. I can do the parallel computation using several uh, data points. And if we take the not the entire million, but then we can say that, okay, we'll make a compromise that rather than between 1 and the 1 million, let's arrive at a compromise and say that we'll create a batch, and that batch size we can define. So we'll create a batch of 100. So I'll take not the entire 1 million record, I'll take the 100 records, then find out what is the RMSE, and then try to optimize that. So that's called the mini batch gradient descent. So you have understood the concept of the gradient descent, one of the very important concept, and that's why I am spending so much time on just this one mechanism, because this one is the heart of most of the algorithms that we'll be using, especially in deep learning and also in the regression. So we have understood how do we find out the minimum, and the good simile is that it's like a blindfolded man trying to find out the bottom of, or trying to reach the valley, or trying to reach the bottom of the mountain. In the same fashion, our algorithms actually are like work like the blindfolded man, not in the real mountain, but in the mountain of data that we have. Now, what happens is that we talked about the how do we take one value, either the stochastic gradient descent, and we'll start doing the iteration. So as we start doing the iteration, we see that our accuracy keeps keeps improving, but it will not really improve in a very smooth manner. So it will, in first iteration, it may come down, then again it will go up. But the trend of that, so we can do thousands and thousands of iterations. So what you are seeing here on the x-axis is the number of iteration, and what you are seeing on the y-axis is the RMSE that you are getting. So as we go on doing more number of iteration, my score would go on improving. But this graph I have shown here just to depict to you that uh, while the overall trend would be improvement, it will not improve with every iteration that we do. So sometime it will go up, sometime it will go down, which is very natural when we are doing a trial and error kind of thing. But with the number of iterations, it will start going down. Now, one of the key things by seeing this graph you will have to make out is that where do I really stop? Because if you see here towards the end, it is becoming almost flat. It means that the first 500 iteration, you actually move from say 4 to 8. In next 500 iteration, maybe you move from 8 to 7, then from maybe 7 to 6. But if you see here, starting maybe 2700 in this particular graph, as After that, your improvement is actually very, very minimal, whereas you are going on doing more and more number of iterations. And after 3000, it becomes almost flat. Now, these are the calls that we have to take, that where do we stop? Because in the gradient descent, my performance is improving. And as we discussed earlier, that I may not eventually be able to arrive at the minima at all. So how long do we go on doing this computation? These are some of the calls that we will have to take, and we will have to learn different mechanisms to tell the system that now stop. I am happy with whatever result I have got after, say, 3000 iterations, because the improvement that I am finding out is actually very minimal. So stop it here. Okay. So this is how the performance actually look like. It will not be very smooth. So although we saw that our uh, when we see here, our actual process will not be this smooth. Our actual process will look something like this. Okay. So we talked about the stochastic gradient descent, where we perform the same operation on one data element, look at the slope, adjust the slope, and then repeat this process on several randomly chosen variables. And what I talked about was a compromise between the two, and that process is called the mini batch gradient descent, where if I have some million record, rather than, I will not take the entire million, I will not take just one, but maybe I'll take 100 or 1000, and then now we can do the same thing here. This one we have talked about, that how, because of different shapes and sizes, you may end up at a. So these things which are not the actual minima, these are called the local minima, and this is called the global minima. So out of, if you see in the mountain also, there could be several small valleys here. So maybe in this particular, say, hill, uh, suppose if we are, one way is to find the bottom, the same problem would be to find out the top. So suppose if we go to these mountains and say that we want to reach at the top of the mountain. So the highest point, suppose, is this. So that's the global maxima. And these hilltops are actually local maxima. So these terms we'll have to remember, the global minima, the global maxima. So in any data set, we may have certain locally optimized thing, or the local minima or local maxima, and there would be a global minima and the global maxima. So in some cases, you may miss out the global minima or maxima, because we are starting from a randomly chosen point. We don't have the complete view of this as we are seeing it. So if you are blindfolded, you can't have a picture of the mountain like this, because if you see, then we know that which one is the top and which one is the bottom. But if you're blindfolded, you have to just rely on your touch and feel, and not really on the eyes that you have. So that's what the gradient descent is. Now that we have understood the gradient descent and the different components of the gradient descent, and these different components were that, what is that we are trying to minimize? So we are trying to minimize our RMSE. What is RMSE? That we have understood. RMSE is, we make an estimation. That estimation may not be actually what the actual data was. So the difference between the actual data and my estimate is the error. Then I take the square of the error, just to ensure that the plus and minus errors don't cancel out. Then we sum those square. We take the average of the those summed squares, and then we take the root of that. So that becomes the RMSE. So RMSE, or the R square, we can choose that which parameter that we want to minimize or maximize. So the example that we had taken, we were trying to minimize the RMSE, and then we follow the process of the gradient descent. RMSE is my performance measure, and gradient descent is my methodology. Okay. Now, once I have these two tools, how to compute RMSE and how to find the minimum RMSE using the gradient descent. Now we are all set to start our experimentation with machine learning and how the machine learning can be used in data science, which is now a very important part of the data science, because the data scientists, as we have seen earlier, they do three kinds of things actually. And some people would expand that to four different categories of work that we do. First is the descriptive analytics, which we saw in the form of computing different aspects of data, like what is the central tendency, what is dispersion, what is the distribution of the data. So the first one is only describing this data. What is the mean, median, range, quartile? So that's one part of the job that we would be doing as a part of the data scientist. That is describing the data that we have achieved or what we have got. The second aspect is that having described or having understood what is that we have got, then we can make predictions, because more and more if you see from the perspective of any business, whatever has happened in the past is good, but until we are able to derive the insights from the past which can be used for future, it's of no use. And that is where the data analysis and data science varies. So data analysts or data mining is more concerned with what has happened in the past. But data scientist is supposed to look at the past and then make predictions for the future. That is what is meaningful for the business. And that's where the data analyst, data mining, the businesses would like to understand that, yes, what has gone right or wrong in the past. It's very important to understand. But then until we are able to see that how my future is going to look like, and how do I make the variations in different decisions, that is, what are the different possibilities of making decisions and what would be the likely impact of that, that is where the data scientist comes in and he says that data mining is fine, data analysis is fine, but see, these are only talking about your past. As a data scientist, I can now make predictions about the future. And whenever we talk about future, we need to be very cautious that we should not give an impression that I am making an accurate prediction of the future, because nobody can. And therefore, as data scientists, whenever we make a prediction, we tell our customers, we tell our consumers of my analytics, like senior management or marketing or finance department, and we say that, see, I am making the prediction, but this prediction, I have the confidence that it will work 90 out of 100 times. It means that my confidence level for my prediction is 90%. So data scientists go beyond data mining and data analytics. We will start making prediction. And whenever we start making prediction, that's where now the machine learning has become a very handy tool for all the data scientists, that in making these predictions, we just don't have to rely on the traditional tools. We can rely on the power of machine learning, where it can scan through the data in an algorithmic fashion and make predictions. So with this, we will be all set to start from next week our journey into those aspects of machine learning which are very useful and which are for a data scientist. So we will take several types of examples and apply machine learning concepts to make different types of prediction. So the descriptive analytics, whatever are the main components of that we have gone through. So for example, the main ones would be, how do we define the data? That is, we define data in terms of central tendency, the mean, median, mode. We define data in terms of dispersion, that is the range, skewness, kurtosis, standard deviation, variance. We describe the data in terms of how the data elements are related to each other, and that's where we saw the concept of the covariance, then correlation, covariance, VIF. So that is how all of these was describing the data or trying to understand the data. So more or less, and then we also saw that how do we understand some of the features of the data by visualization. So we draw the histogram, which gives me the distribution of data or the dispersion of data. Then visualization we did in the form of pair plot, that how do we understand the correlation. Then we saw the heat map. So these are the different tools that we have got. But all of these tools, if you see, was the descriptive data science. So you were trying to describe the data till now. Now, starting next week, we'll move into predictive data science, which is having got the data, we'll actually make the prediction. And we have gone through the building blocks for understanding how to make predictions. Okay, so building blocks of how to assess the performance of my prediction. We have understood what a regression is. We have understood what are the two main parameters to assess the efficiency of my regression process, that is the RMSE and R square. Then we have also understood what is the mechanism for optimization, that is how do I reach at the minimum RMSE, what is the process that we follow. So now we are all set to start the journey into predictive data science. And that journey, I can assure you, will be very, very interesting. This first part, since we're talking about different concepts and a few things you will have to remember, uh, it is interesting, but I can assure you that the next journey will be much more interesting compared to this. But to be able to enjoy that journey, you must ensure that you understand very well all the things that we have talked about till now, including the different concepts in Python as a language. And I will re-emphasize that you need to practice. Only then you will be able to use the predictive algorithms, because some coding you will have to do. As you will see that quantum of coding has actually now been simplified to a large extent. So what would be expected for you is to really know that which libraries to call, which libraries have what kind of functions available, how to call those functions, and what parameters those functions actually expect, rather than you actually coding yourself that much. So things have been uh, fairly simplified. Only a little bit of coding would be required as we go into the machine learning part of it. And the most of the knowledge would be around what are the different libraries available, which function do I call, and what parameters those functions expect. Okay, so now that we are going into it, we need to understand the concept of the classes, how do we instantiate the classes, and how do we call the functions from the classes a bit more. So in the remaining time, we'll move into a few things that we started yesterday, and we could not complete that. That was the discussion on the classes. So we'll continue with that. And that's the next topic that I want to take in the next about, say, uh, 10, 15 minutes.
So we have earlier discussed the concept of the functions. Now, we also talked about that what is a class. Yesterday we had discussed about that what is a class. So class is like a wrapper in which you can put certain data and you can put certain functions. And that becomes a complete object because it has its own data and it has its own uh, behavior, and behavior is defined by different functions. So the structure of the class would be that you define a class, and that starts with so when we define a class, it will start with class, just as functions start with def. It will start with class, then you give a name, and then you could give certain parameters. So we had some errors coming up yesterday. I'll explain to you now that why that error was coming. But this is how the class would be defined. So I've defined, given a name of a simple class, so class simple, and then of course this colon that will be coming everywhere. Whenever you define a class or a function or in the loops, this colon is your companion throughout Python. And after that, it may contain certain data elements, it may contain certain functions, but it's not really a must. So I'm just starting with a simple class which has nothing else, but it just prints that this is a simple class. So it prints here simple class of no purpose, because if I define a class like this, actually there is no purpose. Now we will introduce certain data elements inside the class. So when we come to the next example here, I define the same class, I give the name as simple. Then I define two different data elements, x and y. So these x and y, these become the class variables. It means that in later on, as we see the instantiation of the classes, there would be certain class variable and there would be certain instance variable. So these are the class variables, and we will go into that how the class variables are different from the instance variable. So I'm just gradually expanding the definition of the class. The first one was a simple class, no variables, no functions. Now I am introducing certain variables, and I will be able to get the values of x and y, which is a part of the class. Now I can get the values of these variables by either typing simple.x or simple.y, or I can, say that a is equal to simple, and then I can get the values of that. Now I can also change these values by assigning a different value. So if you see here, x was 35, I can say a dot x is equal to 50. It means that I am assigning a different value to these variables from outside the class. That is possible. So now if I change the value of ax is equal to 50 and then say what is a dot x and a dot y, then I get 50 and 70. So the assignment of the values can be done from outside the class. Now I will introduce a function here. So the class earlier we introduced certain variables, data variables. Now we can also include certain functions. So I'm just giving a simple function sum here, and then the sum function will just print the whatever is the value of x here and the y here. We can refer that by simple.x and simple.y. So when we instantiate that, it is printing this part. So all the functions inside the classes will not be executed on its own. So when I run the cell, it does not really execute this functions inside the class. You would have seen earlier also that even if we define a function independently, when we run this cell, it does not really execute it. It just brings that, it scans the definition of the function. Similarly, it just scans through the class, what are the functions, what are the variables, but it will not perform the function, it will not perform the operations which is contained inside these functions. To be able to call these functions, I need to first instantiate a class. Okay. Now for instantiation of the class, I can still access this function, but I can access this function by giving the class name. So every time I'll have to use simple dot sum. So if you see here, if I want to call the function, it shows me an error, because when we instantiate it, there is no instantiation of these, so these functions are not accessible. But I can access them by giving the name of the class. So if I say simple.sum, then it is performing the action which is there inside the sum function. But I have to refer to that class by giving the class name. It means that I can have only one instance of this class, and that will be called simple. But the very purpose of creating a class is that I should be able to have multiple instances. And that's where if we want to create multiple instances, then we need to have a function which is of this form. A function which will be called init function. So it will be underscore underscore init underscore underscore. And that init will have one parameter for sure, and that parameter would be self. Okay. Now, this becomes must if you want to create different instances of the class. And after that, we can have multiple other functions inside. So in the class, we are packaging different functions inside a class, and obviously we will create the classes by having related functions or more cohesive functions inside the class. So we expanded from the simple class which had no variables, then we saw a class which has only variables, then we saw a class which is having a variable and a function. Then now we are having a proper class which has its own variables, the class variables, which has an init function which will enable us to instantiate it, so we can create different instances of that, and we have certain other functions. So now this becomes a full-fledged form of the class. Okay. So now if you see, having defined this class, I can access the function. So I haven't defined this, I suppose. Okay. So if I pass, so if I call the so I'm instantiating this with two variables. Now this is where I think the error was coming here, that these variables that we will pass to the class need to be defined in the init function and not really as a variable in the not as a parameter to the class. It will be a parameter to the init variable. So x and y that we are sending, that needs to be defined in the init function. So when we are passing 150 and 200, the first parameter will always be self. The second and third parameter will get bound to the init function, and then whatever are the values that we initialize with self dot x, or we can give another name here. So self dot whatever variable name we give. Now when we say self, that means that when we create an instance, that value will get attached to that particular instance. So for example, when we are creating an instance by the name, say here A, now these values 150 and 200 will get attached to the instance A, and I can create. So here if you see, now that I have the init function, I can create another instance of it by the name B, and I can instantiate that with a different set of values. So the first one will have the value of x as 150, the value of y as 200. In the second instance, I'll have the value of x as 50 and the value of y as 500. But I have the access to this sum function with these different values, and that's what the power of classes comes from. So I can go on creating multiple instances. Each instance can have its own values. So these 150 and 200, these are called the instance variables, because these are very specific to the instances that we are creating. So for A, I may have a different value. So here, if I run a.sum, so I initialize that and store that instance to a variable A. Then I call the sum function of the simple class, and then it gives me a result of say, it shows me 350 here. Now you also see the difference between the values of the instance variable and the class variables. So I defined x and y here also, which is the value of 35 and 70, and I am also getting x and y as a for each instance, and then I am storing that as self.x and self.y. And these things which are at the class level, I will refer to them, I can refer to them as simple.x and simple.y. So now within the same class, I can have the class variables and I have the instance variable. Now these instance variables will go on changing. So as you see here, when I run this cell, it prints the instance variable sum is 350 and the class variable sum is 105. When I run the second instance, it shows that the instance variable is 550. So that instance variable, see, it has changed from 350 to 550. The sum has changed because we are using 150 and 200 and 50 and 500. But the class variables remain the same. So that is what we call as the scope of the variable. So some variables will be applicable for the class. It does not matter which instance we are referring to. And there would be some variables which are very specific to each instance. So we have the concept of the instance variable and we have the concept of the class variable. Now, one of the main uses of the class utility that we have in Python is that we can create different classes and then we can use the properties of one class inside another class. And it helps us ensure that we are not repeating those things inside every class. So for example, I define a class by name animal, and then we can define different parameters that as an animal, animals have say 1 head and 2 eyes and 2 ears, and every animal can move. Okay, these are the properties we are just defining, and then we are defining some functions which just prints a few things like how many heads or what the living beings can do. Okay, so I define the class as animals, but there are several other animals which have, so when we go into the subspecies, then we know that certain species of the animal have different characteristics which may be different from the animal as a broad category. So we are defining now a class dog. Okay, and here we are defining the specific properties of the dog. And then here, this is where we are facing the problem here. So when we define a class, it can take parameters here, but that parameters can be only objects or only the other classes. And this class actually is called the parent class, and dog becomes a child class. It means that when I pass this animal, which is a class by itself, as a parameter to the class dog, then it will inherit all the properties of the animals. So I don't need to define again that it has 1 head and 2 eyes and certain other functions which are available inside the animal class. Now that becomes available to the dog class. So I can build the hierarchy of classes where, having defined the animal as a class, all the properties of the animal class I can inherit or I can fetch inside the dog class, so that I don't have to repeat everything which was there in the animal class. So when we define the classes, it can take a parameter, but that parameter has to be another class, not just one parameter. We can define actually multiple parameters, the different types of classes that we have defined. So here, it need not be just animals. If I have other classes defined as A, B, C, I can have multiple classes put here, but it has to be an object. It can't be an integer number. It can't be a string. So that's where we were getting the error yesterday. Okay, so having defined or having passed this animal class as a parameter, that becomes the parent class. It means that all the values or all the functions, all the values, all the data which is contained inside the animal class, now that becomes available to dog class. And this process is called inheritance. It means that we are inheriting every data and every function of animal inside the dog class. Okay, that's how it is structured. So, and after that, we can call the functions of the, so if I call the class as dog with a parameter Tommy, now it will say that Tommy has 2 eyes. Now these eyes, if you see, I have not defined inside the dog class. How many eyes an animal has is actually defined in the animal class. So that's an example of that how we can inherit the features and functions of the parent class. So it will say that Tommy has 2 eyes. This number of eyes is coming from the parent class. But Tommy has 4 legs. Now that how many legs it has was not defined here. That legs is a parameter that I have defined inside the dog function. So now I am able to interoperate between the properties of the parent class and the child class. So it says Tommy has 4 legs. Living beings can move. Now that is being printed by I am calling here. If you see, it is the a function inside the animal class. So I can call the function of the animal class. It prints living beings can move, and then it also can run. So when I call the tom.movement, it says Tommy can run. Now Tommy can run. That is coming from the dog class, because here I have defined that movement type is equal to run. But this is just an example of that we can define the classes. The parameter that the class will take will be another object. And when we pass on the object as a parameter to any given class, those objects become the parent object. It means that all the properties and features we can inherit into our class, and then we have the option to either modify them or use them as is. So having understood the classes and how do we call the function from inside the classes, now it will be easier for us to understand that how when we access the different libraries and classes from uh, different types of libraries, then how to create the instance and how to access those features. So starting next week, we will start going into, we will go into the predictive data science using machine learning. Any questions so far for this session?
So you have two assignments, which I find that most of you have not got time to work, not found time to work. I'll give you maybe one more assignment. Try to finish them by this weekend. Over the weekend, you don't have classes, so please find time and finish that. And all the three assignments, I would like you to formally submit to me by Sunday night. Okay. Fine. So if there are no questions, then we can end the session today here, and we'll meet again on Monday morning. And please ensure that you have submitted the three assignments, two which we have already given and one which I will give by Sunday night. Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and we'll meet again next